Chelsea, it's Dimitri here. I just thought I'd respond to you in a video post just to keep the that dynamic you're talking about going. I think it is kind of cool to be able to hear and see you, and really brings another aspect to all of this. So I thought I'd respond to just a couple of your questions in regards to your resources and your research. Um, I think you're absolutely right. It does feel like we're almost writing two papers here, right? Having to uh, help each other out this way, but I kind of like it. I think it helps me see a totally different part of the book as I continue to help you here. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is that it seems that since your original uh, research or your original post that you came up with a couple more binaries to address in your research. Um, and so that was one of the things I wanted to ask you is that because based on the last post you gave, it seems like you have three separate binaries going on here. You have there's the gender binary you've pointed out, the male female part. There's also I couldn't help but think about maybe a teller versus a listener kind of binary, especially if you're going to focus on Padma as one of your characters. I think that would be another binary you'd have to explore, you'd have to address at some point. And then the other one, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. The other binary you seem to show or talk about was revelation and concealment. You didn't really say revelation. I mean, you focused more on concealment, but I was thinking, well, what would be the opposite of concealment? And it would be I think the telling, right, or the showing, the revealing of the entire story. So you have those three different binaries. At least those are the three that stood out to me as you were talking in your discussion. Excuse me. And so I'm wondering, do you mean to pull out those many binaries? As you were continuing your discussion, it seemed like you were going more towards this idea of the concealed narrator. I mean, Padma isn't necessarily a narrator; she's more of the listener. But you're identifying that she actually is part of the narrator in her questions, right? Like she's probing the storyteller in order to make sure that he gets his story straight. So I'm just wondering, is that another binary you'd want to explore? Is the teller-listener binary, and to what extent does the listener need to be involved? Excuse me. Does the listener need to be involved in being able to tell a story or to make a story real or whole? Sorry. So that's one thing I think that you should think about is, are you tying multiple binaries? And I had to write out the binaries, and I included the little graphic that I came up with here, just to maybe look at and help you think, maybe triangulate some thoughts about how all those binaries are related and what you're actually trying to say about each of those binaries. What else did I write here? I also love the idea that you're changing it up, that you're not looking at how, maybe one is more valued over the other, that it's more of a balance concept. And in fact, I almost wonder if that is your global aspect, because I think that a lot of Eastern literature, or at least a lot of Eastern philosophy and religion, is more about balance than it is about, hierarchy of value. I think, especially, I mean, the idea of the yin yang symbol, or even the mandalas that are used in Hindu religion, those are all about balance, and how opposites, how Westerners deem these binaries, they're actually complements to one another, right? They complete one another. And so I'm wondering if, you ask those questions about, well, to what extent does a listener complete a storyteller? To what extent does a woman complete a man? To what extent does concealment complete revelation, right? I wonder if that's something you can incorporate into it, because I really love that aspect. I also love that, what you kind of identified and how you're trying to fuse Judith Butler's ideas of like, how do we maybe consider ourselves as whole, or maybe the readers as whole, when we recognize the other or the opposite in our reading or our storytelling, right? And it makes me wonder, to what extent does Salim understand himself better because he sees Padma, right? I have more about Padma later, which I'll talk. She's actually my last point that I want to talk about. But so those are just some thoughts about the binary that you've brought up, and I wonder if you can begin narrowing that down a little bit more. I think you go with that instinct of talking about them as complements and not necessarily a reversal of position as a deconstructionist piece might do. And maybe that again, that could be fodder for a global aspect that you take, that concept of balance. Secondly, I almost wonder if, in conjunction with your Butler theory, that you need to tie in something about narratology, especially if you're going to focus on Padma, because I feel like since she is so important to the piece of the story as a listener, I feel like you need to incorporate something about the narrative itself, right? Maybe some ideas about the narrative. And I found, which I've attached in the text part, I found two different sources about narratology that talk about unnatural narratology, or what it means to tell stories that aren't necessarily westernized or linear, or have the I guess the traditional listener in mind. I think both of these sources, just the introduction of the book that I put, actually I think they're both, no, yeah, just the introduction of the book that I put there is enough to talk about how maybe storytellers begin recognizing an other in order to complete a narrative, right? I think that might be kind of an interesting source. And then the other resource that I gave you, the one that's called, let's see, How Natural is Unnatural Narratology. This Fludernick seems to be questioning why we've deemed it unnatural narratology, right? Which I think, again, might be working hand in hand with what your original binary question is, right? That's just a suggestion. I don't know if you necessarily need to go down narratology, but I wonder if that would help you come together with completing your question a little bit more, is, to what extent does Rushdie's narrative help complement your ideas about the binaries, right? So you might want to just peruse those articles and maybe it'll help. Maybe not. I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to see. The last thing I want to speak about is the Padma aspect, and I think it would be really fascinating because I don't really see much. I see a lot about the narrative, like Salim, but I think it would be really fascinating for you to focus completely on Padma. You mentioned, or you asked the question, if Padma is she monstrous? Is she described as monstrous at some point in the story? And she is. I mean, not necessarily monstrous, but she's not. Salim doesn't seem too keen on complimenting her for her beauty, if that's how we're going to say it. In the summary, I haven't gotten to it in the book yet, but in the summary, in a summary that I found, Padma's described as being thick of waist. She has very strong legs, which I think Salim is actually very attracted to. And she also has very hairy arms. All qualities that sort of defy traditional concepts of beauty, and even hinge on the maybe, I want to say insulting, but it's definitely not a praise, that's for sure, right? So she's not, I don't think we're supposed to be thinking of her as someone who's beautiful, and I think she's actually supposed to be a little bit more monstrous and falls in line with how he's described some of the other women. The other thing that I couldn't help thinking about is how Salim dedicated that small passage, I think it's on page 29. He mentions it first on page 20, but then emphasizes it more on page 29, that her name, according to Indian villagers, is a tribute to excrement or dung, right? So I think that in itself helps the idea that Padma herself is supposed to be thought of as definitely an other in conjunction to Salim, and that it also is emphasizing some kind of tension between the binary, right? The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm sorry, before I move on to that last thing, in order to help you, I thought, with the idea of Padma and women and the gender binary piece, there was another resource that I included that I found called Self, Nation, Text, and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, and it's a whole book, and it's actually chapter 8. He has a whole chapter dedicated to women. And there was a sentence in there that I thought spoke exactly to your idea that you presented at the beginning of your last post. And the sentence is, "We cannot escape the conclusion that what Salim fears is not women so much as being male in a world divided along gender lines." And so that, I think, introduces a whole other way that Salim is introducing women, and could also make you think about why he would introduce Padma in his written narrative in order to maybe destroy ideas about a world divided along gender lines. That might help. I think I saw that line and I thought it might be kind of like a crux for your argument itself. Again, maybe not at all, but it might be worth looking at to see what that author has to say about women. In looking at the rest of the article, it's actually more about the women that aren't Padma in the story, but it still, I think, would offer some different ideas to help maybe you hone in on a specific idea of your own. So those are my initial thoughts. That's my feedback. I hope that's enough. If you have any questions, please let me know. The last thing I wanted to say, and this is something that Jen has stated or emphasized in many of her videos, and what she is consistently looking for, I think, in academic papers, is who or what is at stake. And I wonder if you ask that question in regards to the three binaries you've outlined, directly or indirectly. Who or what is at stake for the teller versus listener, the man versus woman, the revelation versus concealment, whatever you're trying to explore there. What are the stakes that you're trying to identify? And I think if you think about that question in particular, it might help you ground what you're trying to say, right, in something more specific. But I can't emphasize enough, I really love the idea of complementing, like binaries that complement rather than try to rework one another. So go with that. I think that's a really strong idea. And I hope some of these texts that I included, including maybe ideas of narratology, help you. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will try my best to respond. All right. Thanks, Chelsea.